Good evening and welcome to Real History, Pennsylvania Industrial History at the Movies. My name is Charlie Fox. I'm the real Charlie Fox. There are many Charlie Foxes with us here tonight for some reason. But I'm a division chief in the Bureau of Historic Sites and Museums with the Pennsylvania Historical Museum Commission, and I'll be your moderator this evening. Now, tonight's discussion is going to focus on the 1970 Paramount Pictures film, The Molly Maguires, which was directed by Martin Ritt and starred Sean Connery, Richard Harris, and Samantha Egger. Now, tonight's program is a collaborative effort that has been brought to you by Drakewell Museum and Park, the Pennsylvania Lumber Museum, Cornwall Iron Furnace, the Pennsylvania Anthracite Heritage Museum, and the Eckley Miners Village. For those of you who may be unfamiliar with us, our museums are 5 of the 21 historic sites owned by the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and administered by the Pennsylvania Historical Museum Commission. Altogether, our sites make up the Pennsylvania Trails of History, a group of special interest trails that lead to some of Pennsylvania and the nation's most unique industrial, military, farming, and community history sites. Now, we're very pleased to have you join us tonight as we explore the history of Pennsylvania's coal mining industry through the lens of Hollywood. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank our partners, the Friends of Drakewell Incorporated, the Pennsylvania Lumber Museum Associates, the Friends of Cornwall Iron Furnace, the Anthracite Heritage Museum and Scranton Iron Furnaces Associates, and the Eckley Miners Village Associates for helping us to bring this program to you. Before we jump into our program, we'll go over a few logistics before I introduce you to the team that's going to be bringing you tonight's program. Now, as I mentioned before, your cameras will remain off and your microphones have been muted for the duration of this program. So if you'd like to ask a question, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We will hold questions for the Q&A period following the presentation, but please feel free to send them as they come to you. Please also feel free to use the chat feature to make comments or to converse with your fellow attendees. Amanda Slider, the Associate Director of the Friends of Drakewell Museum, will be monitoring the chat, and she'll be adding resource links for you later on in the program. Now, our panelists this evening will be Melissa Mann, who is the Site Administrator of the Drakewell Museum and Park, Joshua Roth, the Site Administrator of the Pennsylvania Lumber Museum, Michael Emery, the Site Administrator at the Cornwall Iron Furnace. And completing our panel is our expert in all things mining and industrial, Bodie Morin, the Site Administrator of both the Pennsylvania Anthracite Heritage Museum in Scranton and the Eckley Miners Village, where much of the Molly Maguires was filmed. So we're going to start our program off this evening by turning things over to Bodie, who's going to introduce us to this most excellent film.
Great, thanks, Charlie. And I don't know if my name says Bodie Morin on all of your screens or if my name says Charlie Fox as well. But if it does say Charlie Fox, and that's what you see, I am not the real Charlie Fox. I am the real Bodie Morin.
But anyway, for the record, I am the real Charlie Fox.
So thanks everyone for joining us tonight. We're really looking forward to a fun evening. So like Charlie said, the Molly Maguires was shot mostly in Northeast Pennsylvania. At Eckley and Jim Thorpe in 1968. The film was released in 1970, and then there was a broader release in 1971. So we're still in this 50-year time frame of the since the movie was produced and released. It's a very interesting film that depicts a real situation that occurred in the minefields in the anthracite minefields in Northeast PA. The film itself. It is a Hollywood film, so there are storylines and there are dramatizations and there are embellishments that aren't really accurate. But by and large, the director, Martin Ritt, did a really remarkable job at depicting the social life and the technology and the underground world of anthracite mining. Even going so far as getting the size of the coal chunks right, based on how they wind up after a blast. So the film did some very good things to really to highlight some of the social issues that were going on at the time, and we'll talk about a few of those this evening. The stories of the Molly Maguires, which was which may or may not have been an actual organization. The film depicts violence that was perpetrated by miners against a repressive mining system. So it's a labor versus capital battle. Part of the problem with the film, as far as its reception, was that there isn't really a hero, or there really isn't a right side in this situation. Certainly, there were oppressive mining conditions, and mine owners retained a lot of control and a lot of wealth. Miners who were often immigrants, mostly immigrants from other parts of the world, came to this region, and they didn't make a lot. They didn't earn a lot. They had better situations, more than likely, than where they came from. But it was this constant struggle that we still see going on today. And there was certainly violence. I mean, some of the acts that are portrayed in the film are true. There were murders, there were people that were beaten up, and there was this real violence. So part of the morality issue is, which side is more right than the other. So that was an ambiguity that wasn't really resolved in the film. But like I said, the actual Molly Maguires, that was a label that was put on this group of people who may or may not have existed in real life, by the capitalists, by the mine owners. So they were looking for a way to sort of sway public opinion by creating this terrorist group. Like I said, the violence is real. The violence occurred, but whether it was all perpetrated by a group called the Molly Maguires, that has never been really proven. I will say that there was a group called the Molly Maguires, and it was a militant farming group in County Cork, Ireland. And they did exist. They existed in the 1840s, which was in 1850s, which is 20 years before the time that this film was set, and 20 or 30 years before the time of the actual violence in the coal fields. And the story was similar. I mean, they were oppressed tenant farmers that were reacting to oppressive farming conditions. It just so happened that this group of militants, who were a legitimate or who were a recognized group, tended to be men who dressed as women, and they took on the name Molly Maguires. So I think in trying to sway public opinion, mine owners and industrialists looked for examples that they could then lump onto these people that were committing these crimes. I'm very fond of the film. As the site administrator at Eckley, most of the film was shot there. Paramount Pictures came in. They found a patch town, which is a company town, a mining town that was built by a mine to house its workers. They found one that was still intact, and that was at Eckley. It still had one owner, and it still had a collection of buildings from the 1850s. So there really hadn't been much new construction at Eckley in almost 100 years. So it was almost this ideal setting to create this 1870s landscape. But by the 1960s, Eckley had evolved with paved streets, telephone poles, fire hydrants, electric meters on the side of the houses. So Paramount came in and buried the road, buried the telephone lines, hid the meters, hid the fire hydrants, and sort of recreated this scene with these authentic houses. They recreated the scene of what it might have been looked like a setting in the 1870s. So the filming got done, and Hollywood was going to go away and return everything back to normal. And some people affiliated with the Hazleton Chamber of Commerce decided, we've got this great resource, and it's already been restored to an 1870s period. Why don't we buy it, and then we'll turn it over to the state as a historic site? And that's exactly what happened, and that's how we got Eckley Miners Village. The filming wrapped in, I think, 1968. The group raised the money to buy the houses from the owner around 1969, 1970, and in 1971, Eckley became a state historic site. So the movie had a big impact. Several of the structures that were built for the film are still on the site. We've got the company store. There was a mule barn, and then what's left of the breaker was still there. So it's a great film. It's a great resource for us. And I should also mention too that a lot of the extras in the film were people that lived in Eckley at the time. So it's a very interesting story, and it's great to see that a lot of those elements that we see in the film are still on the landscape today. So I'm going to leave it at that, and I'm happy to answer questions later on in our program.
All right, thank you, Bodie. Now we're going to start our discussion today. We're going to explore some themes. The first theme is going to be Pennsylvania industry. Now, the 1870s that are represented in the film were the start of a period of extensive industrial growth in the United States. They came from advancements in fuel and technology earlier than the century. How did the industries of iron and steel, lumber, and petroleum look in Pennsylvania in the 1870s? And how did they change over the next century?
Who wants to go first?
I do have a section of the film queued up. I can
Okay.
spend a minute of it if we want to do that.
Sure.
Yep, I had a section too to go along with. You're probably going to play the same section.
Oh. Oop, now it's kind of.
That was the exact section I was going to play.
And like I mentioned in my comments earlier, that this is a fairly authentic scene, and I mentioned the size of the coal chunks was pretty much what you would get after the after a blast of anthracite.
Right. I was interested in that because of the prop timber being used. So Pennsylvania's, all of our industries were interconnected. You know, one fed the other, one was profited by the other. Owners oftentimes had multiple interests in multiple industries. And, you know, the timber that went into the mines to prop up the ceiling and keep it from caving in was part of the Pennsylvania lumber industry. And interestingly enough, the wedge, the cap wedge that you saw in that scene, going in above the prop timber, if I may, like to share my screen. And we recently acquired a new object for the Lumber Museum. This is a saw that would have made those mine prop caps, the little wedges that went into the top piece above the mine prop to sort of wedge it in place and hold it in place. This is handmade, one of a kind object, probably the only one in existence. This is the gentleman that used it. His name is Scott Lingle. He was from Clearfield County. And to just demonstrate that interconnectedness, all of the caps that he made on that lumber mill were sold to his brother that owned a coal mine. So it was, you know, one branch of the family was lumber, one branch of the family was coal. No iron or oil that I'm aware of. Sorry, Mike and Melissa, but I don't have a picture of the mill in use, but this picture I think is very reminiscent probably of what the scene would have looked like where they were sawing those mine caps. As the donor described to me, those mine caps could be made by any type of leftover piece of lumber since they were relatively small, stuff that was too small to be sawed into dimensional lumber to make buildings, or, you know, even pieces that were big enough to be turned into the props. His father, Scott, would come in and clean up and take the smaller pieces, the branch, the slash, the other pieces that were too small, and turn them into those caps. So you have a very, very Pennsylvania connection there to both of those things.
Now, Josh, you were mentioning a single.
Well, I feel
family.
like sometimes the bad guy in the coal story, right? Because petroleum comes along in 1859, and
Go ahead. I think we have a lag.
Josh, you were mentioning that in the case of your mine cap or your caps, it was a single family that had branched out. One brother was doing coal, the other was doing lumber. Um, Expand on that a little bit in terms of labor forces. Did you have labor groups that moved from industry to industry?
Yeah, I would say most certainly. You know, I'm not sure entirely how common it was, but you know, especially early on in Pennsylvania's lumber industry, we have a lot of evidence of folks sort of working in that industry part-time in addition to being farmers. So in spring, summer, fall, you can work your fields, tend your crops. In winter, when there's less to do, you can make a little bit of extra money working in the woods. Now, when lumber industry got into full swing and it was really at its peak in the 1870s, 80s, 90s, that was less prevalent. But, you know, especially from the time after the Civil War till things really ramped up, we do have evidence of that sort of cross-pollination between farming and lumber industry. I'm sure there are other examples in the other industries.
Now, in that scene that we saw earlier, it was very much human labor in the case of the coal mines. Now, we're seeing some evidence of machinery in the lumber museum with the sawmills. But how about iron? How about oil? Was that primarily human labor again?
Well, it's human labor, but it's also a much smaller number of folks working in one site, right? So you know, we see within the movie at a coal mine in a coal patch in a coal town that there are a lot of workers, whereas you know on a drilling rig, it's a team of 4, maybe 5. You have the driller, the blacksmith, the toolie, and you have the roughneck and the roustabout, and they're really doing all the work. Now you might have a couple of shifts of folks, but it's a much smaller number of people.
Well, at Cornwall, looking at our site for the iron industry, we had a fairly developed site in the 1870s. In many ways, that would have been the heyday, where we had not only a large producing mine at that point, no longer the largest in the country, but only by a decade at that point, and 4 iron furnaces on the property. So that we had our oldest, the one that's currently the museum, the Cornwall Furnace, which was a charcoal furnace, and then we had 3 anthracite furnaces on the property, and that's one of the ways in which we really do intersect with Bodie's museums, in that it was that appetite for coal that was really running the furnaces that were in our area, and then eventually even those more modern furnaces that were built in the early 1870s were eclipsed in the amount that they were making by even larger iron furnaces and eventually steel furnaces that would come. So our labor force that was there for our one furnace would have been, in some cases in the hundreds, particularly when you look at our going to Josh's, our lumber industry, where we're taking trees by the hundreds of acres and reducing that to charcoal for the furnace. So we have a very large workforce, and that's just our one location. Of course, that was replicated all over central, southeastern, northern, and western Pennsylvania at that time.
Yeah, and I think while in oil, the workforce per well site is smaller, once the Drake well comes in, oil fever hits the Oil Creek Valley, and they go up and down the valley leasing all of the land, especially all of the creek front land, and they just start putting down all the wells. And this is the time when Unfortunately, we completely are denuding the hillsides of all of the trees to put up, either spring pole drilling rigs or, kind of standard, what becomes standard drilling rigs. And so while there are kind of small groups working per well, there are hundreds of, in the 1860s and the 1870s, there are just hundreds and hundreds of wells being put down. And, once the 1870s hits, or I'm sorry, yeah, the 1860s, the early years of the 1860s, the Drake well came in at 20 barrels of oil a day, and that was unheard of. That was a phenomenal amount of oil per day. But a scant, 2-3 years later, drillers are starting to go deeper. They're going down 400, 600 feet, and hitting those deeper sands. And what happens is something that they never even imagined. This is where we get the flowing wells, where we get wells that are producing 1,500 to 4,000 barrels of oil a day. And so it really just turns everything around, and people are even more excited to put down wells.
I think there's similarities with the coal industry as well, because most of the coal was mined by small teams of people. 6, 7. There was a miner, a licensed miner, assistant miner, laborers. But if we look at the whole landscape, a colliery, and especially with coal, everything is in one location. Where you pull the product out of the ground and you process it for market. Within a very short area. With petroleum, with iron, and with lumber, even, you generally have these much greater areas. So I think that we've got a much higher concentration of workers in one spot. Now, I don't think there's any doubt that certainly coal mining we had millions and millions and millions of people working in the anthracite industry. So, and it was spread out over, over 11 counties, 480 square miles. So it was a huge industry. But I think as far as labor organization, it might be very similar to our other industries.
And we've commented a little bit on the synergy between your various industries, but it strikes me that they're all very much in common. These are extractive industries were dominating Pennsylvania's economy in the 1850s, 60s, 70s. There was manufacturing, obviously, but can you comment a little bit further about the extractive nature of this and the renewable nature of any of this?
Well, certainly out of Pennsylvania's industries, that was done on a larger industrial scale. The iron industry was the early industry. Most of the other folks that are sitting here are talking about more 19th century pieces. So it was really the iron industry in the 18th century that was that kind of started the mold within Pennsylvania and became one of the largest producers of iron that really fed out even into the region and during the 18th century. Iron in Cornwall, in its early days, a lot of it flowed down through Maryland and also even into Virginia. But early on, when it came to doing our mining, it's not the deep mining that's shown in the film. It's quarrying. Everything's on the surface. So they're going and taking that out, and over time, as they keep getting a little bit larger, they have to go deeper, and as they go deeper, more and more things have to come for that to be able to do it safely. Larger, workforces that are coming. But even though this was the largest iron deposit, in the United States up into the 1860s, it had a shelf life. Eventually, our deposit ran out. Even though it was shut down by Hurricane Agnes in the early 1970s. By the time that it was owned by Bethlehem Steel, they had looked at the timeline and they thought by 1980 we would be out of really marketable iron ore that was located there. And once it was gone, it was gone. Unlike Josh, you can't replant an iron mine. It's once it's gone, it's gone. So they had to then go and look for other sources. And even at that time period, Bethlehem Steel had started looking at other sources for iron in Canada, in South America, in Mexico, and started to use that to extract to be able to, just get that need for steel to go ahead and to do a lot of building that was going on in that time.
I think what
Yeah,
we
I
see
think-
in the oil industry is that when it becomes more difficult to get oil out of the ground, especially in that 19th century period, which is, 1859 to 1901 is the period where Pennsylvania is dominating the industry, right? Where it's the center of the world's oil industry until the East Texas fields open. But what you see is, they put down wells, they extract, and when the wells start to get slower, when they start to dry up, they find, they're wildcatting, right? They're wildcatting everywhere. When they find a new strike, everything moves there, and then everything moves to the next place. And that's exactly what happens from the 1870s to the 1890s. And the McDonald Field in Washington County in Pennsylvania is really the last big oil field. And I think I read, in the 1890s, they produced in 1 year over 31.4 billion barrels of oil, just behind the Bradford field, which was the first $1 billion oil field. But you see that what Mike's talking about, right? That kind of, where do we go? Where do we go to find more of this precious thing that eventually runs out or becomes much more difficult to get to?
Yeah, in my consideration, Bodie, Melissa, and I, all of our materials, lumber, coal, and oil, are all technically made out of the same thing, the same chemical compound. It's just, your trees have been in the ground for millions and millions of years, whereas, lumber, you need a live growing tree. But yeah, it's, as Charlie alluded to, it's whether you're extracting it from the ground or a living, breathing thing. These are things that were finite, and that is another thing that we all have in common. As Mike was talking about, our industries sort of ran a similar course in terms of coming along at a steady pace, and then a huge spike in demand, and then the eventual decline. And in the case of lumber, the lumber industry has come back to a certain extent in Pennsylvania in the second half of the 20th century. And in the first part of the 21st century here. I don't have the newest numbers. I think as of 2017, it was a $92 billion industry in the state of Pennsylvania. And that's everything from harvesting trees to making furniture. So lumber does have that luxury where it doesn't take millions of years to make more of it. So it did take Pennsylvania's forests about 100 years to regenerate to the point where they were productive again, though. And at the Lumber Museum, that's a question we pose. If we can manage our resources more sustainably, it's really not beneficial in any way to have that long of a shutdown to your industry. If you can just do things in a little bit different way, you don't have to work all of your renewable resource, in the case of lumber, to the point where it's gone. So
I can comment too that, the film really depicts a period in the anthracite industry where the industry is just picking up. It had been around for 100 years by the 1870s, but we see substantial growth really from the 1870s until the 1920s. And a lot of industries sort of have that same sort of arc as far as production. And then we saw boosts after World War I, and then a boost after World War II, and then a steady decline. But we're still mining anthracite coal. There's still an industry here. In fact, I just had a meeting 2 days ago with a coal company, and just had, we had an interesting conversation about who their customers are for anthracite coal. And it's, he was sort of lamenting the political shift in Washington, and who's going to buy the coal. But he made an interesting point that very few of his customers are actually burning coal. They're using it as a carbon source. But I think one of the things that's kind of clear with this program tonight is that Pennsylvania was, I don't like to say the word endowed, but had remarkable number of resources. Anthracite was the first new energy source for the United States. People around here like to say that it powered the first industrial revolution. Before it was wood and charcoal, and like Mike was saying, you've got to, when your local resources are gone, you've got to keep going farther and farther out. Anthracite, you just went into the ground and dig it out. And I think it's interesting though that with coal, it's just the enormous size of the resources. I mean, anthracite alone, like I mentioned before, is 11 counties, but the bituminous fields in Western PA, I don't know how many, is that 20 counties? I mean, and just the amount of coal that's in the ground, all mining has the same sort of economics. You mine until the resource gets too expensive to mine. You never completely deplete a mine. And here, I think there's still a fair amount. I think there was some estimate that there's still a third to a half of all anthracite still underground. It's just that the markets have changed for it as well. I don't know, I think that, because of that, because of the petroleum, the timber, iron ore, I mean, Pennsylvania is a remarkable state and really sort of led the nation in industry for a very long time.
That's actually a perfect point to pivot on right there. The natural gifts that came to Pennsylvania, the iron ore, the wood, the oil, the coal, really positioned it to become the industrial leader of the emergent United States of America. But in the colonial era, labor was in very short supply. So from the mid-19th century to the 1920s, millions of people from around the world immigrated to the United States and Pennsylvania. The film, Molly Maguires, depicts conflicts between Irish and Welsh immigrants. How did immigrants affect and change the social and cultural landscape of Pennsylvania's industries?
Well, I'll start with that, Charlie, just because, again, ours being an 18th century story, we had different people that could go ahead and work in our furnace and in the mines than what were available later. During the 18th century, Cornwall Iron Furnace not only had immigrants that came here willingly, we were a site that had slaves. We were founded in 1742. Peter Grubb, who had founded it, within 2 years actually leased out the furnace to a group of merchants that were from Baltimore area. And very quickly, slaves were brought in to go ahead and to work at Cornwall Iron Furnace. So we had enslaved people through the 18th century, and by some accounts, possibly as late as 1830, that were working in and on the iron plantation, if not directly within the furnace itself. Also during the 18th century, we had other unwilling people who were captured Hessians that came in that were there to work. Several of them appeared to be that they were in the artillerists. So since Cornwall had a contract for naval guns, we think that instead of blowing up the workers, why not let people who know what they're doing to test fire guns to go ahead and to do that. So they were putting that to good use. The other group that came in very quickly, we're today in Lebanon County, but during the 18th century, that was the northern part of Lancaster County, which was predominantly Pennsylvania Dutch. So while you do see Pennsylvania Dutch names there, what you also see is a fair amount of Irish names that come in. So the Scots Irish, some of which are there on their own accord, many of whom are there as indentured servants, many of which did not like it, as the number of runaway ads show that during the 18th century. And then during much of the 19th century, we also have more Scots Irish that are in the area. But then as the time period goes on, then we start to see Hungarians and we see Italians. And, even in the 1930s, we see Spanish speaking Mexicans that are brought in. We see African Americans that are coming from the South as part of the Great Migration who are working in the area as well. So in our industry, we really see almost the entire gamut of 18th century through the early 20th century as far as immigrants coming in and acting as a labor force.
Yeah, so the Oil Creek Valley is actually doesn't have that large a population. In 1859, Titusville is kind of where the Drake Well is. Drake Well is right outside Titusville. It was originally a lumbering town. It had about 300 to 400 people, but by 1870 it has 10,000 to 12,000 people. So as oil is rising, originally mostly lumbering and in agricultural communities along the Oil Creek Valley. We do have German immigrants, and actually a lot of German immigrants who made their mark on the industry. One such is Michael Heisman, who was the father of John Heisman of football fame. He was he owned shares in a couple of barrel making companies, and barrels were extremely important, especially after those flowing wells came in the 1860s. They were much in demand. I always tell people if I was back then, if I was going to be part of the industry, I'd have been a barrel maker because they were premium. But also in refineries, right? German Americans and German immigrants were some of the first refiners. The Humboldt refinery in Plummer was owned by John Bruns and the Ludovicki brothers. They kind of set the standard for scientific process in refining very early on in the 1860s, when a lot of other refineries were kind of just being slapdash together to figure it out as you go. They were really using the scientific process, and they were actually selling most of their refined products to Europe. So really started that international trade of petroleum as well. And then later into the 1860s, post Civil War, we start seeing the Irish immigration and we had a large Irish contingent, mostly working as teamsters, hauling oil.
Well, it's interesting that Drake had a early lumber history. Eckley did too. Eckley was first called Shingletown. So it's interesting that maybe that was lumber and iron were those first two key industries.
Yeah. The Drake Wells actually drilled on land that was owned by the Brewer and Watson lumber mill. If you come to our site where the main parking lot is, that's where the lumber mill used to be.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Well, and we have, and I mean, I'm not quite sure what happened to the shingle makers. I don't know how sophisticated they were. This was the 1850s. But the first building, the first machine they built was a lumber mill too at Eckley, because they had to clear the land and they had to build breakers and build houses and things. But we had a similar immigration history as well. I mean, even though our industry started in the 1760s, it really was an American-led and American-dominated because it was still relatively small up through the Civil War, or even up into the 1850s. And then we start seeing early on, we have the technical people that come in with mining expertise from Germany and England come in and set up the industry in the anthracite region. But then because we need so many laborers, that's when we start seeing the waves of people coming in. So the Irish were the first big wave of immigrants, and Scranton still claims to have the second largest St. Patrick's Day parade in the country. So that Irish tradition is still, that Irish ethnicity is still very prevalent. But then as we saw the industry grow and expand through the late 19th and early 20th centuries, we start seeing influxes from Southern and Eastern Europe as well, just like Mike was saying, and Melissa too, that so we're seeing people from the Slavic nations, from Hungary, from Poland, from Russia, from Lithuania, and from Italy, and and because this industry continued fairly strong through the 1950s, that culture and those ethnic traditions are still here. In addition to the St. Patrick's Day parade, we have like five kibasi festivals in the region. We have a couple of pierogi festivals, and people talk about the bolio, the whiskey drink or the grain alcohol drink that was a Christmas tradition in this region. So we still see a lot of that ethnicity, but the United States was sparsely populated with well, I shouldn't say there were people here, but when it came to developing industry, there weren't a lot of people, so we had to recruit from around the world to really build the industry.
Right. At that point where all of our industries are really taking off, it was not hard to find a job in any of our industries, probably. And as when the movie talks more about Irish immigrants, we don't, at least in the records we have at the Lumber Museum, I don't have as much account of Irish folks working in the lumber industry. Just as we're talking now, I'm thinking perhaps that might have to do with immigrants taking jobs that they're comfortable with or would have been exposed to in their home countries. And as we talk about in the exhibit at the Lumber Museum, a lot of Europe was deforested by the time you reached that second half of the 19th century. The American colonies were sending lumber, was a prime export back to Europe because they had worked through most of their forest resources, before America or Pennsylvania was even founded. So when you've got these folks coming over, they're probably, we see a lot of Scandinavian immigrants, accounts of Scandinavian immigrants and German immigrants working in the lumber industry. And that's where most of the forest reserves in Europe were at that point in time. The other story I wanted to relate was we do have a lot of evidence or firsthand accounts of Italian immigrants working on track crews for railroads. So by the time the 1880s roll around, railroads is prime means of transporting logs and lumber, timber from the forest to the mill, and then from the mill out to consumers. And that required a lot of manual labor to set and lay tracks. And we do have quite a few accounts of Italian immigrants, recent Italian immigrants, working on those track crews. Just pulling some numbers from census data, there were, let me pull my notes up and make sure I get the number right. 4 million Italians that immigrated to the US over a 40-year period between 1880 and 1920. So quite a substantial migration there. The account we have is from a gentleman named John Poletto, who was worked on a track crew. If I can just read a little bit here. All pick and shovel work, no labor-saving devices were available. He was only a boy of 10 when he started in 1898, and he carried water to the section men. At that time, they were in Lebo County, and as a water boy, I carried it to the men. I couldn't get it out of the creek. I had to get it from a spring. Sometimes the spring was close by, but sometimes it might be a quarter mile away. In terms of the discussion we had with labor too, one of the other issues we were going to touch upon, I think, is child labor as depicted in the movie. And I have a nice picture of one of those Italian track crews, if I can pull that up. I don't think this is the exact crew, but the photo is attributed as an Italian track crew. And if I zoom in here at the bottom, we do have quite a young lad here at the bottom holding a cup of water and a bucket. So, multiple collaboration of what was happening in terms of the labor scene in the lumber industry, Italians working as track crews, young boys starting in those types of jobs, and then moving into the more legitimate physical labor as they got older.
Yeah, let's focus on child labor for just a few moments, if we could, because we've been talking about labor from the perspective of ethnic groups. But was child labor truly prevalent? It's depicted in the movie. There's a scene that shows boys working as slate pickers. But was child labor unique to the coal industry, or was it something widely used in other Pennsylvania industries?
I wouldn't say that it's widely used in the oil industry. I would say that you probably had teenagers, young men who were shifting into kind of those roustabout positions. But true children that were kind of depicted in the film, not so much. I have a image here that I would like to show you guys. Let's see if I can find it. Of oil dippers. This is one of our, oops, there we go. You can see here children, and I think this is one of the ways that because of this agricultural tradition in the Oil Creek Valley, where everybody in the family chips in for work. And I think this is the same kind of informal labor for families that children are doing along Oil Creek after the industry kind of takes hold. Oil seeps naturally to the surface, and you skim it off water and collect it in that way. And that was the job of many children in the Oil Creek Valley. It wasn't necessarily part of the formal industry, but more part of the informal industry.
Charlie, there's a couple of ways I think we can talk about that in the iron industry. Again, if we look at Cornwall as being an 18th century story, if we look at that part of it, in that time period, an iron furnace would not have just been a furnace, it would have been referred to as an iron plantation. And almost all of our early operations would have included farms, would have included mills, and were really not self-sufficient in the way that we think of it, but it was much more of a broad jobs and things that were happening at an iron plantation. So especially those jobs that had to do more with agriculture. There were plenty of children that were helping out with that. But just like what Josh had just talked about a week ago, I was talking to a gentleman and he brought in his archive of material from a man by the name of Dewey Bernard. The family's last name had been Bernardo. They were Italian immigrants. Dewey worked for the Cornwall mine from 1912 until 1962, 50 years with the company. And in 1912, his first job was he was a water boy for the track crew that was, laying track in and around Cornwall. And from that, he moved up the ladder to a mine chemist and then eventually a surveyor, and it did a bunch of other things as well. But being that there was, men that were, very physical activity in mining and certainly within the furnace, I could just imagine, days in which they're, casting steel. It's 100 degrees outside, 150, and that idea of having to run water was just a constant thing. So you see people that are starting out, like Melissa said, in these very low skill jobs, but the families involved, they're living in the community, and in some cases, in our case, the industry had already been there for 130 years in the 1870s, so therefore it will be here forever beyond that in kind of their minds. So they're starting in what is just assumed to be the position that they're going to go into, the family business in some respect. So you see child labor, that's their way in to the industry for us.
And certainly, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, please go ahead.
Yeah, and we all know the breaker boys in the anthracite industry, but I think that the experiences of families were similar amongst all of our industries. We have, we maybe unlike the lumber industry where you're having people coming with some familiarity, a lot of the labor force was coming from rural rural areas, coming from maybe cities, but they were coming from places where people didn't have a lot of education necessarily, and where all members of the family had to contribute in some way to the family income, like Melissa and Mike are saying. So we see that in the anthracite industry very early on, that children are a part, well, especially boys, are a part of the sort of the industrial process. And I'll pull up one photo here. Let me see. Oh, you know, one thing I should note about Pennsylvania is that, you know, as a state, we were very good early on about passing laws of regulating how we're going to manage certain mine types, how we're going to manage people. And we passed a law early on, I think in the 1870s, that made the minimum age of working in a mine 12, then it was moved up to 14, then 16. While we were good at passing laws, we weren't very good at enforcing them. So here's a picture of a breaker boy who clearly isn't 12. At least I don't see a 12-year-old there. So it was very much, you know, get the kids in early and get them sort of on the path to becoming a miner. And there was sort of a process in the anthracite industry. I don't know that I would say it was written down, but you start off as a breaker boy very young. Then you can move up to a door boy. So you're managing the doors underground to sort of control where the air goes. Then when you get a little bit older, become a mule boy, where you're taking care of the mules that are used to haul coal around. Then you become a laborer. Then you become an assistant miner. Then you become a miner. So it's a whole life, cradle to grave. And there's a saying that we have there: twice a boy, once a man. So you start off in the breaker picking slate out of the coal that's coming down. You live your whole life, then you get to a point where you're too old to mine coal, and you wind up working back in the breaker. So you're twice a boy. So it really took until the 1920s and some of the work of Lewis Hine, which I'm sure many people have seen his photographs of some of the really atrocious conditions. Lewis Hine shot photographs across the country, but certainly some of the more prominent ones of the breaker boys that really finally affected some change as to how we managed that.
Now, we've talked a few times, we've touched upon the idea that the entire family was engaged in labor across our various industries. I know I once worked at a farm museum, and it was very much the same thing. The entire family was an economic unit. Now, in the movie, The Molly Maguires, the film is depicting women in a traditional passive role as wives and daughters. How did women truly affect and change the social and cultural landscape of Pennsylvania's industry?
Well, I think in the oil industry, you know, a lot of the early kind of oil industry history is, you know, kind of that dichotomy, right, between the saint Ida Tarbell and the sinner, who are our boomtown prostitutes, right? So those are the, you know, in that early history, those are the only women that exist, which is not at all true. You know, we've got a lot of, you know, this informal economy that we've been talking about, right? As these people move in, as boom towns kind of spring up, with that comes boarding houses, restaurants, grocery stores, clothing stores, all of, you know, kind of everything you need for a small town or a larger town. And so you've got women who are doing kind of those traditional women's work, you know, cleaning, cooking, laundry, but they're doing it for pay in the public sphere. But in the oil industry, you also have women who are oil operators. You know, and it's really interesting to once you start digging in and seeing that women actually were part of the industry. Some of them inherited land before the oil strike. You know, Sarah McClintock, she inherited a number of acres, I think like 110 acres, her farm from her husband. And as soon as the Drake well came in, she leased it all, you know, and so she got royalties from the oil found on her property. When she passed away, she was worth anywhere between, they don't know for sure, but the top number could be $500,000. So she was doing that business. There were women who were actual oil operators going out, putting down wells. One of them that I've been looking into, her name is Mary Sand. She starts in Pithole in the 1866. She's putting down a well on the Holmden farm successfully. Then she moves to Pleasantville because that's kind of the next boom area. She's putting down wells there. Then she's in Oil City and she's along the Allegheny putting down wells in the 1880s. So it's interesting that, you know, it's not these traditional gender norms that were espoused at that time. They're not following them.
Well, I think in the coal region too, the film shows women in a very passive role. And I think that traditionally women, at least in the coal regions, didn't branch out of their role as wives and mothers very much. But we recently had a dissertation finished from an anthropologist at the University of Maryland who studied sort of the ways that women created their roles in the towns and found some remarkable agency. That really it was the women that were running the households, women that were in charge of finances, in charge of health care, in charge of education, in charge of even religious education as well. So while they were still wives and mothers, they were really the managers. They were really the people that were in charge of the households. And collectively, you know, while the men were underground, they were the ones that were gathering and pushing for social change. They were very prominent in the labor movements. While they weren't striking themselves, they were out there pushing. I mean, we know Mother Jones, and we know of a few other very prominent women that were, they didn't have their hands dirty. Well, dirty from money, but they were really in very strong leadership roles in the community.
I'm sure it was very much the same in the lumber industry. It would be oftentimes women left behind as the men went out into the woods to work. The way timber harvest worked, you couldn't always work near the place where you lived. You had to create your own community in building a lumber camp in the particular very remote, very wilderness area where the trees were growing at that time. So as these men were living in camp, their wives and the rest of their families were at home. So I'm very sure that it was the exact same situation. You know, the wife becomes the head of household while the husband is away at lumber camp working. We also see, much like the Mary Raines character in the movie, we have a lot of evidence of women that ran boarding houses in lumber towns. If the camp is the center of activity for harvesting the timber, boarding houses were more common in towns where there was other related industries. So men working in sawmill or in other types of factories needed a place to stay. We have several accounts of boarding houses that were owned and operated by women. I have a few other photos I will share very quickly. Another means for women to actually find employment was as camp cook. So we have a photo here of this lady labeled as the cook. This was her assistant or cookie. And I believe these two blurry images here were her two children. Children didn't tend to sit still for historic photos. It's still very active, so they got a little blurred there. Another image I have here is of two young ladies that worked in a kindling wood bundling factory. So the stacks that you can see under their hands are stacks of small pieces of wood that are very tightly bundled in a cord that was soaked in oil with a paper tag. You would take one of those essentially discs of bundled pieces of wood, put that in the bottom of your coal stove, put the coal on top, light the tag, and that's how you got your stove started. So, in addition to boarding houses being in these towns, the younger women, usually typically the ones that had yet to marry, also had some opportunities at some of these jobs in various factories related to lumber industry.
I know one of the things that I thought about when we looked at this question a little bit more is that particularly in the 18th and the early 19th century, we really don't know what the role of women were when there was a man or a husband. Oftentimes was the person that was signing all the documents. but it's only when something goes wrong that the record really reveals what the family partnership oftentimes was. And I think about oftentimes when a tavern owner, for example, or a tavern leasee would have a public house in the 18th century and happened to die during the middle of the lease. Oftentimes it was his wife who then went and took that over and then was granted by the courts the ability to operate that tavern on her own for some time. Or in the case of Emmanuel Carpenter, who was a plane maker in Lancaster, after he died, his wife takes over his business and runs it successfully for some time after that. So there's all of these instances when things go wrong, then only do we get to know what the true relationship oftentimes was within the industry. Within the iron industry, one of the more famous ones of that was Rebecca Lukens in Coatesville, Pennsylvania, that after her husband dies, she has to take over the business, runs it very successfully, and iron is still being, or steel still being produced in Coatesville really to this day because of her taking over the reins of that business. At Cornwall, you had several branches of the greater Coleman family that inherit. And one of the last people that goes and runs part of the company was a woman by the name of Margaret Coleman Freeman Buckingham. And it's she donates Cornwall to the Commonwealth in the early 1930s. But in the 1870s, her branch of the family, including her, is building North Cornwall Furnace, a very modern facility that was there utilizing their shares of the Cornwall mine. They're buying out competition, the Robsonia furnace in nearby Robsonia. So they have an active role in the industry, and eventually then when it's time to cash in their chips, they sell to Bethlehem Steel. So in our industry, we have several instances in which women are not only emerging in these traditional roles where they're running boarding houses and aiding the local economy, they're taking active leadership roles in the industry itself. But again, when you look back into that earlier time period, it's oftentimes only when something goes horribly wrong does that even come to light, even though it had been happening much more frequently than we ever see. It just doesn't make it into the public record.
And I can mention, oh, sorry.
Yeah, actually, I'm going to break in here because there's a few more topics we want to get to and still have some time for questions and answers at the end. I'd like to talk a little bit about labor conditions themselves. Now, all of you are representatives of industrial museums. But no doubt you've seen this, but many museum visitors come to our sites and they look at the length of the workday in those historic periods, the length of the work week, the level of the compensation, the physicality and the dangerous nature of the work in Pennsylvania's historic industries. And simply put, many of our visitors are taken aback just by that tale of severity. Were the workers in the historic coal, oil, lumber, and iron industries fairly compensated for the time, or was it a meager existence? Was there upward mobility in those industries? And what did that involve? And can you talk a little bit, because it's a broad subject, about the relative strength or weaknesses of the labor unions and the overall size of the available labor force? So that's a multi-headed question there, but it's an important topic. So first we were talking about compensation and severity.
Well, certainly the anthracite industry was a very difficult one. It was a very dangerous industry. Working conditions were very bad. I mean, you're underground, and it was only through major disasters that you learned that you have problems. The Avondale mine disaster, killed 100 and some people because there was only one escape route, and then when the fire occurred, there was no way out, and all the oxygen was depleted. So we see a lot of these disasters that sort of reflect the dangerous conditions of working in mines. And you hear a lot of anecdotal stories about fathers telling their kids, you're not going to go into mines because it's dangerous. And part of the structure of anthracite coal itself led to a significantly higher rate of accident and injury than even in bituminous coal mining. I think we have a statistic that over a 30 or 40-year period, there were 35,000 people killed in anthracite mines around the turn of the century. And that doesn't take into account the hundreds of thousands of people that were injured, and then further the injuries caused by black lung. So for us, it was a very, very dangerous and very difficult profession. And there weren't a lot of resources. And you know, the movie talked about the ancient order of Hibernians, and we see it in a lot of places that ethnic communities would create their own social structure. So these organizations would help pay for funerals, help cover doctors' expenses, provide some kind of monetary award or something to help widows manage. So, you know, there wasn't a lot from the company. Companies were still very capital focused, and that's, you know, one of the themes of the film itself. So yeah, so anthracite industry was a very dangerous, difficult one to work in.
I know from the time period in which Cornwall was operating, unfortunately, a lot of that history is lost. The earliest history wasn't covered in the newspaper, but from the time period from like the 1870s onward, when we do have good newspaper coverage in the area, you do not have to go very deep into those newspapers to see exactly how dangerous the mining industry was. And, you know, some of the most heart-wrenching stories that I think that I'd ever see are people that made it through 3 years of the Civil War in hard-fought units and come home and die in a mine accident, or oftentimes, you know, slip off of a rail car on a day and, you know, go under the wheels. And so, you know, it was very common for those things to happen. But within our industry and the furnace itself, it was a long day. It was 2 12-hour shifts. The furnace would be in blast for 10 months out of the year. You worked 7 days a week, 10 months out of the year, a 12-hour shift. So, you know, there's not many folks today that are doing that. But, you know, at the same time, when we look at the names and the records, people stayed for decades, and generations of their family went in and did the same thing. So there had to at least be some satisfaction, sense of community. The money was enough to bring them back in. So, you know, I think at times we put on our 21st century glasses to look back into the 18th and the 19th and early 20th century. And when this was a young country and manufacturing was there and a lot of people were involved with it, that was the norm in so much of the country. And I think people were just so happy to have any opportunity and a job. I know my mother-in-law's family went into Western Pennsylvania, early 20th century, and I was doing genealogy, and I looked, and her grandfather was from this beautiful village that was right on the coast of the Adriatic, a place where today you would go to vacation on. But, you know, the idea is you can't eat sunshine. You know, you need to go ahead and get to a place where there's a job so you can actually put food in your stomach. And that was, I think, the opportunity that Pennsylvania gave. And even as horrendous as the conditions were in some of our industries, or just how bad they were at times, it was still better than starving where you were. And I think that sometimes we kind of lose sight of that, you know, the idea that you could come here and get any sort of work and feed your family, that was better than what they had.
Yeah, thinking about this question beforehand, it gave me a little chance to do some research. Logging is still one of the most dangerous jobs that you can do in the United States today, based on, you know, per capita fatality rates. It's right up there in the top 5 most dangerous jobs you can have in the United States, and I'm sure it was no different around the turn of the 20th century. We have multiple accounts of people being killed by falling limbs, people being killed in derailments of logging trains, all sorts of things. Now, you know, obviously, if you know your job is dangerous, you want to be compensated fairly for that. And this question sort of fed in for me, looking at income inequality today, which is still an issue that our country is grappling with. And, you know, it probably won't surprise anyone to know that it was more equitable around 1900 in terms of what you were making working in the lumber industry than it is today. You know, I went back, I looked at census data from 1900, And they had pulled together some interesting statistics for all of the lumber industry. So they looked at the difference between people earning a salary for the year versus people that were like hourly wage earners, the top and the bottom. So officials and clerks, who were the salaried folks, accounted for about 5% of the total labor force, and they earned about 12% of the total earnings. Their average salary in 1900 was about $931 a year, and that was just about 2.5 times higher than the average yearly earnings of the hourly wage earners, which was about $388 a year. Now compare that with today. The top 1% of earners in the United States takes in about 20% of the total income in the country. So, people are a little removed from it, and they look at the amount of labor involved and are sometimes taken aback. But in terms of what those people were compensated versus what their bosses were making, they were actually more fairly compensated back in 1900 than people are today.
Yeah, I think the oil industry, and I have a couple of images to show here. So the work, just like in all these other industries, right? The work was really difficult. And I think, one of the thing that surprises, one thing that surprises visitors when they come, the first thing they see is the Drake well, right? And the Drake well was drilled with an engine. However, most people in the very early industry were kicking down wells, right, with spring pole drilling rigs. And these two guys were kicking simultaneously on 12-hour shifts and just doing that all day. And they were making about 3 feet a day, right? The depth of 3 feet a day. And so it's backbreaking work. And there's also extremely dangerous work, right? Secondary recovery in Pennsylvania wells, use nitroglycerin. This is a nitroglycerin accident, right? Highly volatile. This was a wagon delivery from Titusville out to a well site. It didn't get very far, and this was all that was left of this wagon. So they knew that these were dangerous things, especially the folks who did the nitroglycerin shooting and transporting and worked in the nitro factories. But they were fairly compensated. I think one of the, and this is interesting, unlike coal, the oil industry never really, organized labor never really gets a foothold really in the oil industry. And a lot of that is because of the transient nature of the industry, right? And I think that's one of the hardships, I think, on workers is that they are constantly moving to where the work is. They're not at home with their families. They're never staying in one place. I think that the way that the industry is set up, today we talk about it as upstream, midstream, downstream. So upstream is exploration, drilling, and production. Midstream is transporting oil, so pipelines, tank cars, railroads, and downstream is refining, right? Finished product. Those divisions, even though they weren't called that in the 19th century, existed, right? And so workers were broken up into sectors of the industry, and so those sectors, their needs, their desires, were often in conflict with each other, and so they couldn't, they were unable to organize together, and that kind of hindered the movement. The very first union in the oil industries in Ohio in the 1890s, and it's about 500. And I think it's the American Labor Federation or American Federation of Labor, and it's the Ohio Oil Company. They have about 500 people. They go on strike in 1904 and they lose. And just months later, after that loss, they hand in their charter and give up. And it's because almost all 500 of their their field workers that were members moved on to to other oil fields in the mid-continent or down on the Gulf Coast or in California. So this transient nature of the industry really doesn't allow for that organization.
Now, one of the main themes of the Molly Maguires, you could argue, is the American dream. Now, I don't know, do we have the clip of James McParland talking about his own American dream? And of course, that's James McParland, is played by Richard Harris. That's okay. We can actually just read the quote. And so you'll just have to imagine that I'm a much younger and handsomer Richard Harris as I'm saying this. Well, younger in any case. I'm tired of being at the bottom of the barrel. I'm tired of always looking up. I want to look down. So one of the issues that's touched upon in the Molly Maguires is the mechanism by which the American dream, wealth, freedom, self-sufficiency, respectability, how do we achieve that dream? Through its protagonists, the film depicts the the film pits the individual pursuit of success against the collective pursuit of success, much the way we were just talking about the unions. How did the workers in the early years of Pennsylvania's industries try to achieve the American dream? What role did management play in influencing their approach? And who really benefited from the promotion of individualism?
Well, I think go ahead, Bodie.
Yeah, I was gonna say, yeah, it's interesting that, like Josh and Mike was saying, the people are coming here to improve their lives, and even though we have these harsh conditions, they're not, the conditions that they're leaving could have been much worse, political persecution, economic persecution, religious persecution. So they came here and they get a foothold in some way. They're not necessarily wealthy, but I don't know that when we actually see the concept of the American dream really until the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, because we still see very strong ethnic ties and ethnic communities, and it seems like a lot of the industrial workers, at least in our region, were really shooting for survival. They weren't even looking for for education or for other things, but just getting to a better point in their life. So I think that we see people looking to improve. There are opportunities for improvement. You can go from a laborer to become a licensed miner. Pennsylvania was very early to pass certain laws about regulating underground work. So there are opportunities, but there's still a cap on how far you can go.
I found another interesting document that I'd like to share while I was digging into that 1900 census. And let me pull that up here. So this was a document appended to the report. It was relative average pay in 100 different occupations. And that was kind of the question we were talking about before is, how did your average lumberman compare with, in terms of what they were compensated for the very difficult and sometimes dangerous work they did versus a miner. So I don't know if my marquee, it is still working here. So miners are listed right here. About $890 a year was what your average miner was making. Lumbermen and raftsmen are right here across the way, $490. So according to this, the 1900 census data, miners were compensated almost twice as well as lumbermen and raftsmen. And that got me thinking back to that scene in the film where the McParland character, Richard Harris, is paid for his first week of work, right? So they're going down all the carts that the amount of coal that he produced, so much per cart, and he makes $9.24. But then the company charges him $9 worth of equipment cost for what he used during his labor, which is not even enough. The 24 cents that he's left with is not enough to pay that $1.50 that the Mary Raines character wants to charge him for boarding at the boarding house. So I kind of, looking at that number, that, a miner making about twice what somebody in the lumber industry was making, one of the perks or one of the expectations of most lumbermen was, while they were in camp, food was provided. They had a place to sleep in the lumber camp building. They had 3 meals a day included on top of their wages, and the jobber, who was the camp foreman in charge of contracting with the timber owner to cut a specific tract of land, was the one that provided most of the equipment. So they didn't need to buy their own saws or their own horses or that sort of thing. It was all provided. So I think, they're probably on a more equal footing in terms of what they actually took home versus while miners might have been paid more at the onset, just, based on the film and what we've discussed before, I think there were a lot more costs associated with that. Also, the cost of having a more transitory or a more stationary life as opposed to a transitory life, which Melissa alluded to, also affected, ability to organize in the lumber industry as it did in the oil industry. And by contrast, let me just scroll up here to the very top page. So bankers and brokers, surgeons, they're making about $1,600 to $1,625 a year, which is still, on the top, only about twice what a miner is making. The average miner, average banker is paid about twice what an average miner is making. And again, if you look at that today, income inequality between someone that is working a job of manual labor and someone that is in the finance industry is going to be far greater than that 2 times. So
let me make a real quick point about the miners' income. You're absolutely right. They were paid by the amount of coal they mined, and they were almost subcontractors. They were little units. So you had 5 or 6 people that worked as a team. So the miner was the only one that would get paid from the company based on the amount of coal that he produced. But then all of the tools, all of the equipment, and if they lived in a company house, and if they bought from the company store, all of that would be deducted. And if you visit Eckley, you'll see that these houses are very, very small, but they're on these very large lots, and that's to allow the families to grow food, so they can make some sort of subsistence, meet some sort of basic subsistence. And there's something called a snake in the coal industry, and that's when you get your pay stub, and your pay stub maybe says you've got, you made $8 in coal, and then all the deductions, and you get down to the bottom, and there's just a squiggly line, which is a 0. You don't get any money, and that squiggly line was the snake. And it was also fun. It was also interesting. In some research, we found that if your take-home pay was going to be 24 cents a particular paycheck, you get there'd be a blacksmithing fee of 24 cents. Next week, your blacksmithing fee could be 75 cents. So it was, the miners didn't do as well as the data suggests.
Well, folks, we're coming up on about 8:30. We do have some questions that were posed to us. Do we have time to address those? Because some of them look very good. Indeed, the first question is from Catherine Donahue. She writes, I know that the mines were located on the railroad line, so I'm curious how closely they were all tied together on the business end. And that's actually a fascinating question.
Well, I can just remark real quick that I think for all of our industries, the railroads were very important in getting the product to market. Initially, there was another state law that said railroads can't own mines, but again, it wasn't enforced. And ultimately, really by the turn of the century, you see these huge corporations where the railroads are owning all of the mines. So they produced the coal, they transported the coal, and they ultimately sold the coal. And it's interesting that Eckley, the company that ran Eckley Miners Village while it was mining coal, was the last and largest independent mine that wasn't affiliated with the railroad, but they were very close.
I'll just jump in just for a second on that. I know within our industry, transportation was the game changer. Early on, our industry went into canals, in a very big way to be able, because all of our things are heavy and there's a vast amount of it, and they need to, and transportation costs were some of the biggest, profit killers within the industry. So when railroads came around, because in our case, the Coleman family had been already in business for several decades, they built their own railroads. And that way, then they were able to connect to all the raw material that they needed and move product to where they needed to go. So it's no coincidence that the railroads are being located near the industry, because either it was a profitable way of doing it for the railroads, or you had the industry that would just go ahead and make the financial commitment themselves and build the railroad themselves.
Yeah, and interestingly, there were no railroads in the oil region when Drake strikes oil. And so transportation becomes an extremely important part of the evolution of the industry. We're hauling with Teamsters, with by wagon. We hardly have any roads, but it has to get to the Allegheny River so it could get to the refineries in Pittsburgh. And so, we see this real big push to get the American, or the Atlantic and Great Western to Franklin, the Corey line down to Titusville, and then the Oil Creek Railroad that goes up, goes parallel to Oil Creek, and getting all of those lines built so that we can get oil to market quicker, because the quicker you get there, the more money you get.
The timber owners that own the land where the lumber museum is now were two brothers with the last name Goodyear. They owned multiple sawmills. They had private railroads that supplied those sawmills, and they also started the Buffalo and Susquehanna Railroad, which became a publicly owned railroad, and that railroad actually outlasted their lumber business. So Buffalo and Susquehanna ran in Potter County, where the museum is, up into the 1970s, while most of Goodyear's lumber plants and sawmills were closed down before 1920.
Now we have a few questions from Jim McCauley as well. And he notes that in the 18th century, Ben Franklin was looking forward and was talking about concerns about population growth and the amount of land would be needed to support these growing communities. During the rapid growth of the extractive industries, which you are representing through your museums, was there anyone like a Benjamin Franklin who was aware of the potential depletion of these resources that your industries relied upon, and possibly making suggestions on what might replace them to keep the Commonwealth's economy stable?
I'll go first. No. Simply because even today, we think oil is going to last forever, and the industry, is still pushing that we can still supply oil. We got to go deeper. It's harder to get to, but we can get the technology. The industry would say we can find the technology and we can get to it. And so I don't think in the 19th century or even the early 20th century that people, especially in Pennsylvania, thought that it was going to run out. We still have a strong independent oil program in Pennsylvania, people pumping oil and producing. So I don't think that we had somebody who was thinking that far ahead.
Yeah, I would tend to echo what you say there, Melissa. I know when we look at all of the early pieces talking about Cornwall, the word that keeps coming up is inexhaustible. That was always the description. It wasn't, it was inexhaustible. And when we talk about the time period of the movie, the 1870s, that was the first time they actually started drilling boreholes to see how much is actually here. But we know that, in the 1850s, they go on a huge building campaign where they start improving. One of the noteworthy things in our area is the architecture, so much stone architecture. Most of that's from the 1850s. So at least at that time period, again, the Coleman family had already been doing this for decades, and they had so much faith in how much iron there was still in the ground that they improved everything. Everything became built out of stone because it was going to be there, practically forever. And it's really not until you get into the early 20th centuries that you have mine engineers really that start looking and say, well, you know what, maybe someday this will play out. So we ought to start looking at some other places and around. So yeah, I would agree with you, Melissa. In the early days, everyone's a salesman and keeps saying it's inexhaustible.
Yeah, I think the early days too were nobody really knew the concept of sort of end. But I think really when you get into the later 19th centuries, especially in mining, maybe even more hard rock mining than coal mining, you start seeing these waves of concern about depletion of resources. And the whole notion of conservation right after the turn of the century in mining was about preserving what we have. If you could imagine copper mining, in the late 19th century, so you've got electricity, you've got transatlantic cables, you've got this high demand for copper, but everybody's, we only have so much of this high grade copper. So there was talk in the 19th century about figuring out ways to best utilize that. But what nobody counted on at the time was the fact that technology would improve so much that even though you don't need 6%, grade copper, you can process 0.5% grade copper. So I think, there were these successive waves of concern, but there were also these new waves of technology that sort of alleviated some of that concern. But we should all know Rachel Carlson. Her work sort of looked at sort of the end of resources. And real briefly, I'll mention an article that was written by some geographers in the 1960s who were sort of looking at the coal region in Northeast Pennsylvania and came to the conclusion that, well, we're not going to see the kind of economy from coal mining here ever again. And that there's only one solution, and that solution is heritage. So it was very interesting look at how to replace that industry with, well, the industry that we're all in.
Yep. Lumber, very briefly, is a very similar story. Not until about the late 1880s, 1890s that anybody starts to ask questions about when all the timber is going to run out. Fortunately, there were programs put in place at the national level and the state level focused on conservation efforts. And today, all of our publicly owned forest land in Pennsylvania is certified well managed, meaning that it's managed sustainably and with the thought of having it be there for generations to come in mind. So I can happily say that the Pennsylvania lumber industry did learn some lessons from the practices of the 19th century, and we are on a much more sustainable trajectory with our lumber industry in the state today.
It seems pretty clear that back in the old days, it just wasn't so much of a concern. Indeed, there's a comment in chat from Melanie noting that she had read about the mines at Old Buck Mountain that basically tapped out in the 1880s. That was certainly the case with some of the mines I'm familiar with out in Somerset County. Now, we do have one more quote or one more question, and then actually a comment, which might be a great place to end and reflect upon. The question, again, from Mr. Cawley, but he's referring to Irish immigrants coming to the coal regions and not really being aware of any history of coal mining taking place in Ireland. Is it fair to assume that the people that were coming to work in the mines were inexperienced when they were hiring on?
Yes. In fact, it was just, except for the early people that came from Germany and England were sort of mine managers and engineers. They had skills. Most of the rest of the people that immigrated here did not. Even though there was mining traditions in other countries, the people that came here were generally coming from a more agricultural background, except the Welsh. I mean, we did see a good shift of Welsh coal miners moving here. And Scranton, I think, has the second largest Welsh community in the country right now. But for the most part, most people came here to take labor jobs, didn't have any experience or skill.
Okay.
Yeah, I would have to say, Bodie, with what you're saying is that it seemed like the Welsh were brought in even for other extractive industries. If you get into the slate belts within Pennsylvania, they're bringing in Welsh miners very early on. I know at Cornwall, we were really a quarry up until the 1920s. And then they got to a certain point where they had to go underground. So by that time, instead of going to Europe to poach people, they went to other deep mines in the United States to go ahead and get people that knew about how to do that, because we'd never had to do it before. So, in, I think, all of our industries, particularly if there was someone doing it already, it was a lot easier to go ahead and grab someone from somewhere else than it was to, go ahead and have a petroleum engineer that you just, wave your magic wand and poof, there they are. So I think we all saw that. And of course, those would help then train, the great mass of other labor that would have to come in and work in the industries.
Isn't that kind of how petroleum engineering works? Magic
It
wand?
is absolutely magic wand, no science at all. But I agree with what Mike's saying. I think that, in the petroleum industry, it's really, they're faking it until they make it, right? They know that they can drill, or they think that they know it's there, they can get to it. But what's really interesting, and it goes back really to our initial question, one of our initial questions about the intersection of our industries, right? Is that the oil industry is very strategic about looking at what other industries have done and what problems they've had, where they've had successes, what tools they're using, and they're all about not recreating the wheel, right? And saying, okay, how can we take this from this industry and use it to help us in petroleum? And also, for example, we've seen labor over here in the coal industry, we've seen some of the strife and the issues that they've had. How do we not have that? So they're looking, and they've got a bigger view of the industry and how to build it into what they want. And I think then it's training, as they're learning, training workforce.
And I think a good place to end here. There's one final comment from Mr. Cawley, and that was in reference to our discussion about the American dream. And you noted that the circumstances in Europe at the time of the movie that the Molly Maguires is set in the 1870s drove many immigrants to our shores. And he wondered if many of them were cognizant that the decision to leave home might just be a severe stopgap measure, and things wouldn't be that much better when they got here. Yet at the same time, they were filled with hope that the lives of their children might eventually be improved. And isn't wanting a better life for your children part of the American dream? I don't think that's something we can necessarily have to answer, or perhaps even should. That's something for all of us to think about. I know for my part, I'm a descendant of immigrants from all over Western and Eastern Europe, and I can only marvel at the courage it took for a family to just simply leave everything they'd known behind and come up and start anew. And this still happens today, and I marvel at that just as well. So I think that's a good place for us to leave. And we'll turn things back over to our host for a few final words.
Well, thank you. I'd like to thank all of my colleagues. I think we've been talking about doing this for a few weeks now, and preparing for it, and we've had fun. At least I've had fun all along the way. Chatting about our stories, how they intersect and how they don't. And so I appreciate the opportunity to get together and to share knowledge and to learn from these great folks. So I hope that you all enjoyed it. We thank you for coming, and we will at some point be back again with another segment of Real History and with another film. So thank you very much, and please do take a look at our websites and our Facebook pages, and we'll keep you up to date on our upcoming events. Thanks, everybody.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
It's been an honor. Good night, folks.
Thanks, Charlie.
We made Charlie put on real clothes. Come on, we need more than thanks. We need to buy him something.
Thank you, Charlie.
Well, I had to finally abandon my flannels. What can I tell you?